Great. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming to this invitation for an open discussion about the legends of Glastonbury. Now, I've got a pile of books with me. There's probably about 20 of them. And I haven't got a fancy background because I wanted to show you book titles. So Glastonbury Myths and Archaeology, just as an example. And Glastonbury is a fascinating town. I was trying to think of any other towns in the UK that have as many books written about them as Glastonbury does, and I can't think of any, with maybe the exception of London itself, but Glastonbury is tiny, really. It's 9,000 people as a population. It's quite a small town. And yet it's rich with legends. And because of those many legends, there are tons and tons of books about Glastonbury. And as we have our chit chat, I'll grab various books and show them to you if they're relevant to the topics that we're talking about. But before I do that, I just want to show that I've actually got 4 of my own books. The biggest one is Gwyn, which is 700 pages. And I'm not doing this to plug the book. It's just as an example of where I'm coming from. So Terrestrial Alignments of Catherine Maltwood and Dion Fortune. And there's Myths of Avalon by me. And the reason I'm showing you these is because I lived in Glastonbury for 20 years, and my social circle, my friends, were fellow researchers into the legends of Glastonbury. And even though I've written those books, and it amounts to over 1,000 pages, I don't know everything there is to know about Glastonbury, of course, but I do know quite a bit. So the legends are rich, and I just want you to feel at ease and fire away. You can ask any question you want, and we'll just take it from there. Just imagine we're sitting in a cafe in Glastonbury, and what legend interests you at this moment in time.
Well, for me personally, I'm always drawn to the tour whenever I go down to Glastonbury. It's just, for me, I feel myself recharging. It's almost like it's got its own heartbeat. I don't know if anybody else feels that when you have been down there. What is that? I mean, I know it's sacred, but what else is going on there, and why is everybody so centered around that area? It's quite powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was about 14 years old, and I was living in the Midlands, a city called Coventry, as a 14-year-old, and I was reading a book about King Arthur, and there was a black and white photo of Glastonbury Tor in the book. And to the 14-year-old me, it was like something out of Lord of the Rings. It was like Tolkien-esque. What is this tower on a hill, And that it was another 5 years. When I was 19, I finally got to Glastonbury and was able to visit it for myself. But the reason I'm saying that is that it's not unique. There are, having lived there, you encounter people month after month, year after year, visiting Glastonbury just to visit the Tor. And it has that pull on their psyche, and it pulls on their heartstrings. And they can almost have no knowledge at all of the legends and history. They just want to go and see the Tor, So it is this incredible. My friends call it the mashed potato mountain. That's a reference to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But there's various people obsessing about this landmark in America, and one man makes it out of mashed potato. And so that's the Tor, you know. So there's this book, it's got a picture of the Tor on it.
Yeah.
Avalonian Quest by dear old Jeffrey Ash, who passed away some years ago. And there's booklets like Glastonbury Tor by Nicholas Mann. And even going back to the 1940s, there's Glastonbury Avalon of the Heart by Dion Fortune and stuff. So there's plenty of books about Glastonbury and Glastonbury Tor. And the Tor itself has many legends. My main book, Gwyn, this one, shows the Tor on the cover. You can see the tower there.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually see the constellation of Orion above the Tor. So here's a thing then. Long before I moved to Glastonbury, I moved there in 2001, but I'd been visiting for years, of course. And one thing I was aware of was a huge ley line that most people call the St. Michael line. And the St. Michael line goes from St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall up through various St. Michael churches across Bodmin Moor and north of Dartmoor, and then it goes to Glastonbury Tor, which is a Michael church, and carries on to the Stone Circle of Avebury, and carries on right to the Norfolk coast. But the thing with this line, apart from it having lots of hilltops with St. Michael churches on it, it points to sunrise at May Day at Beltane. That's the basic story, but it's actually more brilliant than that. It points to sunrise at Beltane and Lunasa, and it also points to sunset at Imbolc and Samhain. So the 4 Celtic fire festivals are aligned with this line of energy that goes up and down the land, and Glastonbury Tor is on the middle of that, you know. So I guess that was my first background to it. And then when I started looking at the folklore and legends of the Tor, of course, the most famous one is that there's a king of the fairies called Gwyn ap Neath. And Gwyn ap Neath has this battle every Beltane with the Summer King. So Gwyn is the Winter King, and he battles the Summer King every Beltane. So, I mean, just that in itself, you know, on the ley line, the Michael line, pointing to Beltane sunrise, has only been public knowledge since like maybe the 1930s, 1940s. Can't trace knowledge back before then. And yet, medieval Welsh lore says the god of Glastonbury Tor has a battle every Beltane, and this ley line points to Beltane sunrise. So that's just one of the mad legends of Glastonbury, you know. And what does it tell you about the Tor? You know, it still leaves lots of questions to be answered, of course, you know. And one of my little eureka moments was understanding that Gwyn ap Neath, king of the fairies, lord of the other world, corresponded with the constellation of Orion, what we call Orion the Hunter. And from the centre of Glastonbury, where the market cross is, and also from the site of where there was once an Iron Age lake village, from those locations during the winter months, the constellation of Orion comes out of Glastonbury Tor and goes hunting. So
interesting.
Already there's a couple of mad things there, aren't there? There's this big alignment pointing to Beltane sunrise. There's a Celtic god of the other world who has a battle every Beltane. His corresponding constellation comes out of the Tor. throughout the winter months. So it kind of makes the Tor what you could call a hollow hill, because the hunter lives inside the hill, he goes hunting, so he's kind of like living in the hill. And it makes it the hill of the Winter King, because he has a battle every Beltane with the Summer King. So it's his hill. And then, which book is it? This book here, Star Temple of Avalon by Nicholas Mann and Philippa Glasson, talks about their research and Nick's big discovery. I can't remember when it happened. I'm guessing round about the early 2000s. Somebody was on St. Edmund's Hill in Glastonbury at winter solstice, and they were watching the sunrise through their bedroom window. And it seemed that the sun appeared at the bottom of the Tor and started to move up the side of the Tor. And the person ran and grabbed a kind of video camera, an old VHS camera, to try and film this phenomena. And the sun was too bright and glary, so the person then grabbed a motorbike helmet and put the visor in front of the VHS camera to try and filter out the brightness of the sun. Anyway, Nicholas Mann gave a presentation about that at Chalicewell. I'm guessing round about 2007, I think it was, roughly that time. And it was astounding because there on film footage, speeded up, the phenomena takes about half an hour, but Nick had speeded it up to take just 30 seconds. But the sun at winter solstice rolls up the side of Glastonbury Tor.
Oh, wow.
And that's astounding because, not being aware of that, I'd already made my own conclusions that Orion the hunter was the Winter King, and the Winter King lived in Glastonbury Tor and went hunting across the night sky. And then Nicholas Mann comes up with this winter solstice phenomena. You know, so again, it's the Winter King's hill with this winter solstice phenomena. And a quick jump ahead from that is that this little book of mine, the Pagan Temple of Glastonbury Tor, there is evidence of a Romano-Celtic pagan temple on top of the Tor. But what would have happened then from St. Edmund's Hill, looking at the Tor, that winter solstice, the sun would take half an hour to roll up the side of the Tor, and then it would have entered that pagan temple. That's all mad stuff, you know.
It's incredible. I love it.
It's not mad. It's quite incredible.
Yes, yeah, no, it's wonderful. Now I say mad with a happy heart.
Yeah, yeah. But then, you know, aren't all of us that go to Glastonbury and do all that sort of thing? Aren't we all a little bit mad?
Yeah,
Yeah.
In a good way.
Blessed are the cracked because they let in the light.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And also they're open. You know, it's not linear.
No.
You know, people that I know that, you know, think the same way as me, we're much more open to. We're not. You know, it's not black and white. There are grey areas.
Yeah.
And so then there's other ideas about the Tor. You know, there's the what do you call it? The kind of there's like a spiral around the Tor, and people think that it might have been a maze at one time. I don't know what you would call those ridges, like kind of like an embankment that goes around the Tor. So there are theories about the Tor being a three-dimensional spiral labyrinth. Now, that's quite popular with some people. And on the south side of the Tor, there's a big stone called the Egg Stone, and people see that as a sacred stone. And going along with the fairy tradition, some people see it as the entry point into the Tor. So, you know, it goes back to this idea of hollow hills or different gods and goddesses living inside the hill. I would suggest is because various constellations are coming and going from those hills, you know, but those constellations relate to different gods and goddesses. But that's a whole idea then of hollow hills, you know, and that's been used in fairy lore, where King Arthur and his knights or Finn McCool are in a hill sleeping until the land needs them, things like that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Are those ridges, you do notice them, don't you? But I mean, I've seen them, and it makes you wonder what they're there for, because you see them in other countries actually when they're farming, aren't they? There's those ridges as you go up a hill, isn't it?
Yeah, like terraces. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
But when I'm crawling up there and trying to get to the top and gasping, I have to say I'm really pleased now that a couple of them have got little benches.
Yeah.
I've been up there all times of the year, and in the winter when it's wet and cold, and it's quite an experience, you know, and monstrous, yeah, and fall down it as well in the wet cold,
yeah,
because you can't see properly.
Yeah.
So
up there a couple of weeks ago, and we got the sunrise. Literally, we were up there, and it was still dark when we were up, when we finally got to the top. And there was some other people there. There were some Americans there, and they were there, and they were like, "Oh, this is great!" And I could see that the sun was coming. We could all see the sun was coming, and and then they left. Oh yeah, we've seen it now. And I'm thinking, no, you haven't seen the best bit. You know, the sunrise. It slowly started to come up. Everything was covered in this beautiful blanket of cloud, and I was very emotional actually. It always does that to me. I mean, you just look like you're looking out at heaven, and it was just beautiful. So yeah, very quiet, very peaceful, very lovely.
Yeah, first thing in the morning, if you get up there when nobody else is up, if you can get up there in the summer sort of really early, and if there's a little bit of mist, you really do get the idea that you're, you know, it's a glass island, and it is just, you could be anywhere.
Yeah.
And it is magical. I mean, I know magical makes it sound a bit twee and a bit cliche, but I mean, it is just magical.
I don't know how well this will look on screen, but this is from Glastonbury Myth and Archaeology, but it shows the ridges of the Tor.
Oh gosh, yeah, it shows them really clearly.
They're quite perfect as well. Yeah. I mean, they could be to do with growing grapevines is one theory, or if it's not the maze, it's like a processional spiral up the hill or what have you. But so distinctive. It does occur here and there on some hills in Somerset, but nothing like on the Tor. On the Tor, it's profound and dynamic and symmetrical, you know, whereas other hills in Somerset's more erratic and not so profound, you know. Yeah.
Has anybody come up with a geological sort of explanation for the tears? Because that's usually what happens. You'll get an archaeologist coming along who'll sort of like completely poo-poo or any of the mystical stuff and come up with a proper sort of, you know, geological explanation for it. Has anybody done that?
Not that I'm aware of. I've seen programs where one person was dismissing the idea that it was a maze or processional route, and that they were very much of the opinion it was simply to do with growing grapes at a time when the climate was warmer. You know, it was warmer when the Romans occupied Britain and stuff, you know, and also the monastery, Glastonbury Abbey, couldn't really use it for anything other than growing grapes or grazing sheep, you know, but the Abbey would have been quite keen to use it in some way. But equally, there's easier hills to work with. And for instance, Weirior Hill is less of a steep climb and would have been easier for growing grapes. So again, it doesn't really, it's a theory, but it is by no means absolute at all.
And I've climbed up there wearing robes, so certainly if you were a monk and you were climbing up there in a habit carrying things, it would be a nightmare. And I'm
Yeah.
wearing robes, and that's bad enough.
Equally, on Bodmin, no, sorry, on Dartmoor, there's a place called Brent Tor, and it's on the St. Michael line. It's a church dedicated to St. Michael, and it's this rocky promontory hilltop on the north of Dartmoor, and it's a nightmare to climb up. Again, apparently it's a church for the local village. Well, the old people wouldn't get up there very easily. You know, it's more about the symbolic declaration that you've put this church on this awkward mountaintop more than anything. You know.
Is there a node on the top, Yuri? Does the Mary line go? Is there a node with a Mary line as well? I remember reading Hamish Miller and Paul Broadbent's book, and I know it's part of it, but I can't remember if there was a node on the top.
So that's ley line terminology. Is a node where the two lines cross over each other?
Yeah, where the two lines cross, yeah.
Yeah. As far as I remember, so I haven't got it here with me, there's a book called The Sun and the Serpent, and it follows the St. Michael line, ley line, and there's two serpentine energies that run up and down it. One's masculine, one's feminine, and they're called the Michael line and the Mary line. So they kind of snake up and down the Michael line, and here and there they cross over each other, and they're called node points. And I think, as far as my memory goes, they dance around each other in Glastonbury Abbey near the high altar, and then they make their way to the Tor, and I think they make some sort of intricate pattern on the summit of the Tor that is almost sexual. I think the Mary line makes almost like a curved, cupped shape, and the masculine line almost makes a phallus going into it. So whether they actually cross over each other as a node, or make this suggested fertility interaction, I can't remember if it's a node or not. But it's a very interesting pattern. Yeah. So you would have to check out The Sun and the Serpent by Paul Broadhurst and Hamish Miller.
Yeah. I have the book.
Yeah, because they've got diagrams of what the currents do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I vaguely remember Lawrence Main at one point talking about it. Lawrence is the lay hunters.
Yeah, I know Lawrence.
Well, that was one of the very first times I heard you talk. It was a long while ago now. You gave a talk on Catherine Maltwood's Glastonbury Zodiac, and I think Lawrence has subsequently sort of mentioned it with Glastonbury as well. So yeah.
But another thing that came out of my own research, and it was to do with the Glastonbury Zodiac. Myself and a friend called Barley, who passed away some years ago, we thought it would be a good idea to have a powwow of all of the people we knew that were interested in the Glastonbury Zodiac. So we pulled that together, and I think it was 2010 when we had our first Glastonbury Zodiac powwow. And there ended up with about maybe 20 to 30 of us. And we called ourselves the Maltwood Moot. And we all had an interest in the Glastonbury Zodiac and Catherine Maltwood, who discovered it, and so on. So we would have regular meetings. And at one of those meetings, maybe around 2010 or 2011, a few of the women in the Maltwood Moot were interested in flower essences and creating flower essences. And they wanted to go to the various sacred rivers and pools and little waterfalls that were on the Glastonbury Zodiac, and they wanted to make flower essences connecting with the sacred water features of the Glastonbury Zodiac. And spinning off from that idea, myself and Alan Royce, we decided to go and look at the two rivers. Now, there's two rivers that flow through the Glastonbury Zodiac. And so we went to the source of each of those rivers just to see what there was to see. And just before I get there, what's quite interesting is that the River Carey, which goes from Castle Carey, goes through all of the summer zodiac constellations. So it's like the summer river. And the River Brue goes through all of the winter zodiac constellations. So these two rivers are a bit like the Summer King and the Winter King, or that, you know, they're kind of sharing the zodiac signs of 6 summer signs and 6 winter signs. So anyway, Alan and I went to the source of the River Brue, and that was like the most amazing Pandora's box of, it just opened up so many discoveries. And one of them is understanding where the source of the River Brue is. And it comes from an area which today is called Stourhead, which is a National Trust property. But go back many centuries before it was Stourhead, going right back to Roman times, that area was known as the Great Forest. In Roman Latin, it was called Silva Magna, the Great Forest, and the Celtic name Coit Moor means the Great Forest. And what you have there is there's 4 rivers that come out of the center of the Great Forest, and those 4 rivers flow north, south, east, and west. It's like just perfect magic, really. Now, the direction west is the direction of the setting sun. And in Celtic mythology, west is the golden realm, the twilight realm, the land of eternal youth. It's where souls go when they die. They follow the death of the sun before the sun is hidden and there's reborn in the east. You know, so the west is the setting sun and the direction of the other world. So here's a magic thing then. The river that flows west from the Great Forest is the River Brue, and it takes you to Glastonbury Tor.
Oh.
So Glastonbury Tor then is this prominent mountain in the west, you know, as seen from the Great Forest. That's what it is. Of course, then the river carries on into the Bristol Channel and now into the Celtic Sea, you know, but that symbolism of the King of the Fairies or the Winter King's Hill being in the west from the Great Forest is also very special, you know. And if you think about the legend of King Arthur at the end of his life being taken to Avalon and Glastonbury being Avalon, it can only be on the River Brue because there's no other rivers to Glastonbury. So whether he's going to Glastonbury from Salisbury Plain or whether he's going to Glastonbury from the Bristol Channel can only be on the River Brue, you know, and the River Brue is that river to the other world, the direction of the Great Forest to the west. So another thing about Glastonbury Tor, you know, that it's the sacred mountain in the west from the Great Forest.
It's so nice, isn't it? All these things that are based around it. I love it. It's just magical.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right word, definitely.
And there's always wonder, you know, so even like sharing some of those ideas with you, I would say none of them are conclusive, you know, that they're ideas that flow in and out of my brain. It still doesn't explain why me as a 14-year-old was drawn to Mashed Potato Mountain.
No.
These are just fascinating things I found along the way, you know, but even without even knowing those ideas, people are just drawn to the tour.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
know.
that's true. I think I was probably about 14 or 15 the first time I went, and obviously I got up the tour a lot easier and a lot quicker. And there's something that draws you there, and it's still the same today for me. I mean, it's obviously okay. It's a lot more commercial now, which is sad in one way, but you know, it keeps the town, it keeps the town going. But I mean, I love the way they've opened up the White Spring as well. I mean, when I first started going to Glastonbury, that was nobody knew anything about it, and it was, or if they did, they kept it very quiet. But I mean, now it's. I suppose in a way, the first time I went, it was lovely because there was nobody there. It was very quiet. It was very peaceful, very sort of spiritual. The last time I went, it was full of German tourists taking off their clothes and jumping in the pool, and it was just hideous. You have to, you know, you've got to time it right. That's the one thing I would say about it. You really do have to time it right. But it just seems like every time you go, even though I've been going for years and years, you find something new, or there's something else jumps out at you, and or you feel something different. Sorry about the cat's bum.
Yes.
Oh, it's lovely. Yeah, I think I was there, I think in 2005. So maybe lots of things as different now. Not the tour, but all the other things around, I think.
Yeah, I lived there long enough to get to understand the rhythm of Glastonbury. You know, there's people that are there decade after decade. There are regulars, and there's local people that are just not interested in anything at all. And then equally, there's almost a wave of a zeitgeist, or it's hard to put a word to it, but what can happen is, like, at any period of time, there might be an overall group of people in town, and there's an ambience or something going on dynamically with that group of people, and then they're gone. And 3 years later, it's another group of people. So there's kind of waves of activity where people are drawn to the town. Like the Cathars were there for a 3-year period some years ago, and made their presence known, but then they were gone. And then there's another group of people. So the town kind of has this cyclic wave of esoteric or new age things happening, and yet equally there are people that are there constantly, and there's people that are esoteric and people that are not esoteric. So the locals, for instance, almost feel nothing of the energies and frequencies, or that they're just in a different they're in a different mind zone. So my first few years, I was a taxi driver, and I actually got to know the Glastonbury Zodiac landscape very well because of taxi driving. Drove around it every day, and I gave one passenger a ride, and he was a local man, maybe around about 25 to 30 years old, born and bred Glastonbury, and we're just driving, and I mentioned Glastonbury tour, and he said, "Oh, is that the hill with a castle on it?" Mad, you know, it's not a castle anyway, but he knew nothing about it, yet he was local. So, "Oh, that's the hill with a castle on it," you know.
But you have that in other villages too. In other countries, you have that too.
Yeah.
So it's just
What's
funny.
the
So the High Street, Glastonbury High Street, they did something some years ago where they did a gathering and they called it diversity in unity, or unity in diversity or something. But they did a survey in the town to see how many belief systems were represented in Glastonbury. And again, it's only 9,000 people. And they did their survey, and in that small town, there were 70 different belief systems being practiced that they knew about.
Wow.
So all of those esoteric beliefs and ideas are in Glastonbury High Street. It's, for a psychic person, you're going in and out of radio stations constantly.
Yeah. Yeah. Continuously.
Yeah. Somehow it all belongs as well, And some people have a rough time in Glastonbury. Generally speaking, if people are just visiting, they have a wonderful time. Glastonbury is an amazing place and people fall in love with it. But equally, I've seen people try really hard to live there and it just doesn't happen for them. And other people will try and leave and it just doesn't happen for them. It's like the spirit of place decides who's there and who isn't there, And that's a strange thing, and it's acknowledged by the Glastonbury Tourist Information Centre, where they actually have occasionally workshops and talks about the so-called Glastonbury experience. And some people have a very tough time with it. Other people have an amazing time. But again, it's a Somerset market town of 9,000 people. What other towns have all of that going on?
Yeah.
So
it is an amazing place, and yeah, I love it to pieces. It's not everyone's cup of tea,
So, Yuri, the Glastonbury Goddess Conference, what's the history about that? Is that only the name of the conference, or is there something else behind it?
So there is something else behind it, and I don't know the full origin of it precisely. As far as I'm aware, it kind of began in the early 1990s. So it may be that there was stuff going on in the 1980s, but it's not my knowledge. So there was a rise of goddess-focused spirituality, and there was the creation of the goddess temple. And the goddess temple was a permanent feature that anybody could go in all year round. It was, as far as I'm aware, the first goddess temple and part of the goddess movement in Glastonbury. And you hear a lot of criticism of it, and you hear a lot of negativity about it, but I actually think it's a brilliant thing. Of course, there's always clashes between people, and people get involved and fall out with people who are organizing it and all of that stuff. But all of that has happened over the years. For instance, and I don't know if this is true or not, this is just rumor, grapevine stuff that you hear in the cafe culture. But one of the criticisms of the early years was that it was men-hating, dungaree-wearing women fighting against patriarchy. That it wasn't very warm or friendly, that it was almost militant. Now, I don't know if that's true. I've met ladies that were involved in the early days, and they're all brilliant. They're all lovely people, but I think maybe it's the politics of the time, the 1980s and the 1990s. And equally, I fully respect the pushback against patriarchy. you know.
Mm.
So I'm all that. I'm all for goddess-centered spirituality, but equally, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. So when you're all goddess and you have no god, then you're also losing the pantheons, and the pantheons of Egypt and Greece and Rome and the Celtic pantheons of Ireland and Wales. There's lots of gods and goddesses, you know, and things have changed and evolved. You know, in recent years, there's now another temple which is for god and goddess, and it's understanding that the roles of the goddess in different stories is sometimes as mother, sometimes as lover, and so on, you know. So you need the kind of yin and yang there. So there's much more openness now to understanding, you know. You can't talk about Arian Rod or Rhiannon or Blodaieth or other goddesses without the soap operas they're involved with the men in their world, you know. That they are there. So when you're anti-patriarchy, that is mainly reacting against the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, getting rid of the one God. That's understandable because of all of the abuse those things have done over the years. But equally, the pre-Abrahamic cultured people were pantheons, you know. So yeah, so nowadays, somehow, sorry, back to the question, somehow out of all of that, the Goddess Conference manifested as a once a year thing, which lasts for about a week each year. And I think, I'm not completely certain, but I think it's 33 years now. It's certainly in the 30s. That it's become an annual thing. And I'm one of the few men that has been invited to give talks and the stuff, you know, because I am a goddess bloke, you know. I'm goddess focused and spirit of the land and pantheonism, I suppose, you know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. But there's so many priestesses of Avalon now, and they all have, they're all strong characters, and they fall out with each other.
Yeah, there is a lot. There is a lot.
There's always that. It's really difficult to keep everyone happy, you know. And yeah, and there's a wonderful saying, and this is from a lady called Lady Olivia Robertson. She was one of the founder members of the Fellowship of Isis. She passed away.
I knew her.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I met her a few times because after the Goddess Conference, there would be a small Fellowship of Isis gathering, and I got to meet her a couple of times. And someone talked to her about various groups of people in the goddess movement falling out with each other. And she said something really profound that stuck in my head. She said that the goddess never subtracts, she only ever multiplies. So all of those falling outs are really just cells subdividing and multiplying. And, you know, so what matters is that people are true to themselves and follow their own heart instincts. And sometimes that means that you don't stay with this tribe or this gang. You go off and create a new gang or whatever, you know. So that was Lady Olivia Robertson. The goddess never subtracts, she only ever multiplies.
That's good. There's a lot of, like you said earlier on, there's a lot of priestesses of Avalon. And then when you look into that, they're advertising that you do these 6-year or whatever courses and things like that. And I find that hard because I think do you need a piece of paper to say that you're practicing that, or you are connected, or it's you have the teachings. You can have the teachings without having to do this big long course. I don't know whether it's got commercial is what I'm trying to say, and that would be worrying if it did.
I agree with you.
It's
I do agree.
yeah, that's a valid criticism, of course. One of the valid criticisms of Glastonbury is its commercial spirituality. And how can that be avoided as well? If we're looking for workshops to learn something or other, then there's an element of commercialism, isn't there? Or even if it's just paying someone a wage or paying for the hire of a hall to teach the workshop, and so on. So it's about integrity, really, and whether you're signing up for a course or a workshop with people with integrity or not, and I can't judge that, and it's almost like you have a sweet shop and you have to just suck it and see if it's good for you or not. And,
it was whether it feels right, I guess, and as long as it's heart-led from here, then it's good.
Certainly, and not naming any names, but there are lots of frauds in town.
Okay.
And equally, there's lots of integrity in town, and I think whenever you've got a place that's hustling and bustling and workshop after workshop after workshop, that's always going to be the case, or maybe even saying they're frauds is wrong. It might be that they're not as enlightened as they think they are, or that they're trying to make a 20-week workshop out of something you could learn in a weekend, things like that, and that's impossible to evaluate, really,
But there's also the argument that if you do make it, I don't know if it is 6 years or not, but if you make something that in depth, you are only going to get people that are committed. You're not going to get people that just think, oh great, I just want to put Priestess of Isis after my whatever. So I mean, that could be part of it as well. But I mean, I did the OBOD course, which technically is 3 years, but it took me 8 years to do it, just because I wasn't fully focused due to other things. But it does it weeds out the maybe the commercialism, I don't know, but it certainly makes you more dedicated if you can do that one.
On the one hand, you can criticize these things as being invented in the last decade or so as a training system, but equally, if you look at Western society in the 1960s and 1970s and 80s, where do people go to learn paganism, to learn esoteric wisdom, to learn magical way of thinking? Where do you go and learn that? So these things are new, or people had to set them up. We don't really know what the ancient Druids did, but OBOD is a recognized school that has integrity and teaches people, and equally the goddess training of the priestesses of Avalon is now decades old, and there's lots of people there with integrity as well. But it will never be right for everybody.
No, and it's also very easy now, because I'm old enough to have been around, in the 70s when I was starting off on this sort of path, and there was just nothing. There was no internet. You go to a library, and if you went into a library and asked the librarian for a book on magic magic or something like that, you'd probably end up in the children's section.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier now, but of course the problem with that is because it is easy, you do get, as you said, you get a lot of charlatans because well, easy access.
Or even if it's not charlatans, you get a lot of stuff taught and then repeated, which has no great lineage behind it. It's just something that was taught 15 years ago, and it starts to become a dogma.
Yeah.
And you think, oh,
I mean, Wicca is, you know, everybody, a lot. I've spoken to a lot of youngsters who say that, you know, they're Wiccans, and they mistakenly think it's an old spirituality. Well, it isn't at all. It's, you know, it's, and when you talk to them about, you know, maybe traditional witchcraft or something like that, they don't want to know, because what they've been brought up on is like the Sabrina, the teenage witch, and that sort of thing. And that's, as far as they're concerned, that's what Wicca, magic, witchcraft, that's what it is. And of course it isn't. You know, and I've said to them, you know, go and talk to your grandmother. You know, talk to somebody that's got some experience, some life experience, and you know, okay, maybe she does only make little things in her kitchen, potions and whatever, but where did she get that from? She probably got it from her grandmother, who got it from her grandmother. But whenever I come across Wiccans, it always I feel slightly sort of, I never know how to approach it, because I need to be very careful what I say, because I don't want to make them feel, you know, that their path is wrong. And there are some brilliant things in Wicca. Some of the training is very, very good, but what you have to remember is it's not ancient. It's, you know, you're not going to go back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years with it.
Yeah. So here's a thing on the side then. Going back to World War I, 1916, during World War I, a lady called Margaret Murray regularly gave lectures at Chalicewell. Chalicewell was run by a woman called Alice Buckton, and she had it as a kind of college, and there were regular talks each week during World War I. And Margaret Murray was a regular speaker there. Now, during World War I, 1916, she started investigating traditional witchcraft in Somerset. And there were two well-known covens of the 17th century, the 1600s. One of them is the coven of Wincanton, and the other was the Brewham coven. The interesting thing with the Brewham coven is they were centered at the source of the River Brew that flows west from the Great Forest. So she was looking at these traditional witches at the source of the river that flows to Glastonbury. Anyway, she carries on doing her research, and after World War I, in 1921, she writes her first book about her witchcraft cult theory of Western Europe. And it's based on all of her studies of looking at things in the 17th century. And she followed that up some years later with another book called The God of the Witches. And it was her books on witchcraft, traditional witchcraft, that inspired Gerald Gardner to create Wicca. And so, although she didn't create Wicca herself, Margaret Murray, who was at Chalicewell and the source of the brew, is acknowledged as the grandmother of Wicca, or that Wicca was based on her studies to some degree, although Gerald Gardner added a load of stuff to it. So I think, although teenage witches just signing on the dotted line and just doing Wicca as it is in American way, you know, that it is just this thing, that's kind of like the first step, or that's like Wicca for beginners. And one would just like to hope that as they grow and evolve, they get interested in their own history. And if they do, their own history would take them to Gerald Gardner and Margaret Murray at Chalicewell in 1916 and so on, all the way back to the Brougham witches. So again, I think the modern world, what frustrates me with the modern world is it's all sound bites. People don't read 300 pages anymore. They go on YouTube and watch something for half an hour and make an opinion about something. And I think a lot of the modern witchy books are like that. It's like, blah, 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 here's a spell for love, or here's a spell for this, that, and the other. And there's no deep esoteric training or anything. Just get a pink candle and a rose quartz crystal.
Don't forget the roses.
Yeah. Veronica, what book is that?
It's Sabbath for Witches. It's Janet and Stuart Farrar.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know, yeah, because I actually met Janet. Because I'm Irish originally, and I actually met Janet in Ireland, and I never met her husband, but they had a series of books on Wicca and witchcraft. Just as an aside, an additional lot.
And they were putting books out before the internet, weren't they? So they were part of the old school, if you like.
Yeah, this dates to what date was this? Just trying to find when the date it was published. Well, this dates from 1981, but was a reprint, I think. Yeah, because they had a whole series of books, and Janet is still very active, if I can tell you, up around the Boyne Valley area. That's where she's living now.
Yeah.
Another one as well I tend to direct people to is Doreen Valiente. If you want to get a real good grounding in I mean, I know she was with Gerald Gardner, but no nonsense approach.
Yeah.
So it's back to the goddess never subtracting but only ever multiplying. You know, there's all of these things for beginners, but really there has to be their threshold things, aren't they? You know, how does someone go from knowing nothing to starting to learn? You know, that you need threshold things, whether it's beginner witches or beginner priestesses, or pick up some dowsing rods and this is a ley line. You know, that there has to be thresholds for beginners, and then it's down to their integrity to explore the decades and centuries of history.
I wonder how long it'll be before somebody comes up with a Magic for Dummies book.
Oh, you just found out my secret. I'm just writing it.
So going back to the Somerset witches, there's something I want to write about. I'm going to write about it next year. But Robert Graves, in his book, The White Goddess, he describes the covens of Brougham and the covens of Wincampton that Margaret Murray was investigating. And he makes a point that they were both 14 miles from Glastonbury Tor. And he says that they're just a part of a network of other Somerset covens that were all positioned around Glastonbury Tor. And that Glastonbury Tor was seen as the central hub of their focus, if you like. I don't know what else to say about that other than put that out there, you know, that there was this idea, again, that Glastonbury Tor, as well as being the sacred mashed potato mountain in the west, was the centre point of the witchcraft covens of Somerset.
Last year I went down to Glastonbury for Samhain, and the Goddess Temple did a witch walk on the evening of Samhain all around Glastonbury, and they read out the names of all the Somerset witches that they had knew of that had been tried and executed in a lot of cases. And there was a couple of places where they went round in Glastonbury. They ended up, probably predictably, outside the front of Glastonbury Abbey, where they held a little sort of service and a ritual. But on the following day, when I was walking around, there were, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so Christians walking through Glastonbury, carrying quite a large cross, and they were reciting presumably some words from the Bible. I'm not sure, because I'm afraid my knowledge of the Bible isn't that brilliant, which was difficult. I found it really hard that there was, because it was obviously very much against what had happened the night before. But it didn't have a good feel. If it's done in a way of not a sort of like an apology or a sorry, but in a reverent way, it would have been a lot better. But it wasn't. It was almost menacing in a way. It wasn't. It didn't leave me with a good feeling.
So
Sad.
one thing that's come out of Glastonbury in the last century or so, beginning about 1890s, so end of the Victorian times, is this understanding esoterically of the return of the divine feminine. And back in the end of the Victorian times, it was seen in a kind of pseudo-Christian way. There was a man called Dr. John Goodchild who wanted to promote the Celtic church literally as the bride of Christ. And he was thinking about the goddess Brigid, Bridie, and that there should be some union between the feminine and the masculine Christ. This was his late Victorian esoteric thing. But the reason he had those ideas in the first place is because the occultists and esoteric people of late Victorian times were fully aware of the transition from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. Okay, so with the coming of the age of Aquarius, who or what is the figurehead, the divinity, the divine aspect of this new age, this new aeon? Well, logically, it's all to do with Aquarius, you know, and the main Celtic fire festival that happens in Aquarius is Imbolc. So for the next 2,500 years, from a Celtic perspective, the divine figurehead of the age of Aquarius is Brigid, Bridie, Brigantia, you know. So this is why this late Victorian Christian mystic was trying to suggest, well, we need the bride, the Brigid should be the bride of Christ for this new aeon, if you like. So from that then has grown the basic idea that what has been missing the most is the divine feminine. In 2,000 years of patriarchy, where is the goddess? So these things were brewing, brewing. These things were brewing in Glastonbury right at the Victorian times, in the Edwardian times, and during First World War, with the awareness of the witches and everything. And Alice Buckton, who had Chalice Well, actually described Chalice Well in 1918 as the Aquarian well, thinking deliberately thinking of the age of Aquarius. And she also wrote poems about Bridie, Brigid, you know. So she was, Chalice Well was all about Bridie and Brigid and it being the Aquarian well. Now, what's interesting with that is Chalice Well is the Aquarian well 20 years before Catherine Maltwood discovers the Glastonbury Zodiac and says you know, Glastonbury is Aquarius and Chalicewell is the waters of the Aquarian age and all of this stuff, you know. So all of that is coming out of the return of the divine feminine in the Aquarian age. So those are the seeds that germinated in Glastonbury through the Second World War and into the 1950s and 60s, and then you have the beginning of the goddess movement and all of that sort of stuff. You know, it does have heritage in it. You know, it didn't just suddenly, it didn't happen just because people were taking psychedelics in the 60s. You know, it was growing, and various magical occult groups were calling the goddess in. And so two things then, and there's, with the return of the divine feminine, there's a lot of abuse of the divine feminine that has to be witnessed and just honored and respected and understood. So, for instance, with the Arthurian romances of King Arthur and his knights looking for the Holy Grail, the reason they're looking for the Holy Grail is because the land is a wasteland and they're trying to restore the wasteland. And the wasteland is external, it's the landscape around you, but it's also internal, it's the landscape inside you. You know, if the land is well, the people are well. If the land is bad, the people are not well, sort of thing. So restoring the wasteland is trying to bring about heaven on earth, all that kind of stuff. So then there's a medieval story about why there is a wasteland in the first place. And that's called the Elucidation. You can look it up on Google. It's a medieval poem called the Elucidation. And it explains why there is a wasteland and why King Arthur and the knights are looking for the Grail. And the simple story of it is that all around the land, at sacred water features, there were divine spirits called the Maidens of the Wells, or the Well Maidens. And these were like eternal spirits. They're more than human. They're the divine feminine of sacred water places, sacred sanctuaries. And whoever was traveling around the land, people on pilgrimage or knights on horseback or just travelers, you could go to any well maiden and receive water and food and healing and be looked after. You know, that there was this union between the people and their land. And then the story tells how there was a bad king one day who raped one of the well maidens. And not only did he rape her, he encouraged his men to rape the other well maidens. And then so the Elucidation says that because the well maidens were raped, they took their golden bowls and they left. And then the land became a wasteland. So the whole story of Arthur and his knights trying to find the Grail is a metaphor for trying to restore the divine feminine in the landscape, you know, to bring back that healing. And then in Arthurian stories, it's romanticized into knights and chivalry and maidens in distress and all of that pantomime stuff, you know. But then also you can bring it forward to the 1600s and the 1700s and the witchcraft killings. You know, that the esoteric wisdom. I mean, some witches were men, but mostly they were women. That they were burnt and killed and stuff. You know, so that there is trauma in the landscape. There's ancestral trauma in people's bloodlines. There's past life trauma in people, you know. So when I say the divine feminine returning and that it needs to be paid witness to, you can't even begin to heal any of that abuse without first just witnessing it and holding it and understanding it. You know, so you can understand in the 1980s and 1990s the beginnings of the goddess movement being very anti-man and anti-patriarchy. There's all that stuff playing itself out. Back to the source of the brew, where the Brewham Coven of Witches were, there was a noble family there of what became Stourhead, but they were known as the Barons of Stourton, and their coat of arms was 6 fountains, 6 water springs. You know, and it was acknowledging that, you know, the main thing of their landscape was these sacred waters. And that's where the Brewham witches were active until they were punished.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's funny, you know, all of these undercurrents are there behind Glastonbury, but most people going up and down the high street aren't aware of it.
No.
You know?
No, and they're pulled to the heart, aren't they? And then there is a lot. There is, like I said earlier on, there is a heartbeat there, and people, I guess, are exploring and slowly just becoming enlightened to what they're drawn to. You know, because you walk up there and there's so many different things, you know, that you could be drawn to at that moment. But yeah, it's I was just thinking about witches and my husband's family, actually, not to do with Glastonbury, but is in their family. There's documented the last witch of Dawes Heath in Fundersley, and she's actually documented. So we know, when you were talking about ancestral lines, I was thinking about my daughter. Then I was thinking, yeah, we got that one coming through. It's interesting. It is.
It's been recognised now, hasn't it, scientifically? There's something, I think it's called epigenetics, which is ancestral trauma, which is inherited. And somebody much cleverer than me has done something on the DNA, and they discovered that there is actually something in people's DNA which they're classing as ancestral trauma, which is carried through all the way through the DNA line, which is fascinating, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Especially now, scientifically, they're talking about it. We've all known this for a long time, you know, about ancestral trauma and everything coming through and you carrying it forward. But now the scientists are seeing that. I think that's great.
Yeah.
There's so many different magical training systems, especially on Glastonbury High Street, you know, but I think what they all have in common, or what they should all have in common, is that from one methodology or another, you make a connection with your eternal self and the bigger picture of all that you have been and all that you are, you know. So that's it in a nutshell, really. You know, any other magic, love spells, are just petty things, aren't they? You know, it's not really doing the great big soul journey that you're here to do. You know, have a bit of fun along the way with a rose quartz if you want to, but no, the spirit world is much more profound than that.
Yeah, it's become quite fashionable though, hasn't it? Have you not noticed that? It's really trendy. There are a lot of readers and things out there now, you know, and there never was before. But yeah, it'll go down again, and then they'll be interested in something else, you know, and or, you know, we'll just watch it unfold, really.
But back in the 1980s and the 1990s, Glastonbury was incredibly unique because it was, for England, with maybe the exception of Camden Market in London or something, it was the only place you could go to find tarot cards, candles, incense. It was the only place. You know, now you'll get tarot cards, candles, and crystals in every town, in every supermarket. You know that, but back 30 years ago, Glastonbury was that threshold, that mecca for people that were awakening to pagan worldview or magical worldview.
Mhm.
Go back to the 70s, it was the only place outside Camden Market where you could buy a pair of loons.
Yeah.
Funny.
It's a very special place, you know. So yeah, the cafe culture at Glastonbury is people just drifting in and out, people looking for a tarot reading, people just looking at all the mad characters in the town. And
Yeah.
then there's druids and Wiccans and new age gurus, and so, you know, everything is there. Yoga schools and Tai Chi schools and crystal healings and herbalism, and it's all there on that one high street, you know. And the high street it's an L shape. That's all it is. You've got the main up and down and a little bit in front of the abbey, so it's like a capital letter L. It's just an L shape, but on the corner of that L shape is all the cafes, and the way we've been talking for the last hour or so, that's every day in Glastonbury, these kind of conversations.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
it's one of the few places in England that I go to that I can just sit there and maybe get out a crystal and maybe get out and douse for something. If you know, if I'm thinking, God, what do I want for my dinner? Okay, well, and you don't feel, or I don't feel weird.
No.
Everywhere else I go, I remember my mother saying to me something years and years ago before she passed. She rang me and said there was something on TV. She said, you know, it's you know, the funny stuff, the stuff that you like, and that stuck with me because I think, well, funny stuff, is that what it is? Is that? But when you go to Glastonbury, it's normal. It's not funny. It's not odd. It's just normal.
Yeah. You feel part of it. You feel part of it. I've had some great chats down there with people. Just walking. I love the fact that you can just, I know how I do. I say hello to pretty much a lot of people down there, and getting to know people down there, and I love the fact, like you say, you can just have these conversations with people, and you're not looked at like, oh, what are you talking about? You know, it's great. You kind of blend in.
That is so special, isn't it? You know, because that you can't do that in other places. It's like being gagged.
Yeah.
You know, that you just can't talk about this stuff with other people.
No, you have to be careful what you say. I find that a lot now. I go to say something, I think, oh no, shut up, because they'll think you're a nut job, or but it doesn't happen in Glastonbury. It doesn't really matter what you say.
No.
But yeah.
And then what I noticed in Glastonbury is that people, you know, in the cafe culture, you can get quite a heated argument going on. Someone would be arguing about this, that, or the other, and be very, very passionate about a belief system or something or other. And then you realize 3 years later, the same person has changed their mind entirely. And you realize then that all of these passionate, heated arguments are fluid, they're mutable, you know, so that all for an open mind, everything has to be free of dogma.
Maybe that's the power of Glastonbury, though. It makes you evolve.
Yeah, you know, you have your own personal journey, and if you try and cling to a dogma, you're going to get stuck, you know. So it's more about, I think the Aquarian age is about taking the gemstones out of every mystery teaching and working with it if it works for you, you know, because wisdom is wisdom, enlightenment is enlightenment, and it doesn't belong to any specific culture or method, you know.
No.
and we're all always in flux and always changing, and we're always uploading and upgrading our thought processes.
Mm.
So being somewhere where you can just be free to babble about what's in your head at that moment in time. And that's incredibly liberating, where you're not going to be judged, you know, that
Yeah.
you are just a questioning spirit.
Yeah. Inquiring minds.
An inquiring mind. Yeah. About fear of retribution for being a heretic or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Burnt at the stake.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Burnt, yeah, without being burnt at the stake. Yes. Yeah. You can have conversations about what the energy's doing that day and things like that. And I mean, I do that with my close friends who are also healers and everything else. But like you say, down there, it's just part of the norm, and it's fantastic. So I've been down how many times? 3 times already. We were down there for autumn equinox, actually. That was lovely. I was in the goddess temple meditating, and then I didn't have my eyes open at that point, but I was suddenly aware that the place had filled, and there was just suddenly all the energy lifted. It got very strong in there. It was amazing. So I thought, I'm staying here for the day, I think. It was just really good. But yes, because there was a lot. I can't remember the group, but there was a group that had come, Scandinavian, I think they had come down. I got pictures of them. They were up at the top of the tour, all in their beautiful red robes. And I kind of cracked my eye open. I thought, oh, it's all of them. But you know, they'd all come in as well, you know, to sit in there. It was beautiful. Nice to see so many different people, and especially from different countries as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not only English people, is it? You do get a lot of Europeans that come, and Americans as well, but because they read about it, they heard about it, and they just want to come and experience it. And it's, yeah, I mean, that in itself is lovely, I think.
Any other legends you want to talk about?
The Holy Thorn.
The Holy Thorn.
Yeah, so it intrigues.
Yeah.
There's book.
It's probably the best book you can get, by Adam Stout. Glastonbury Holy Thorn, Story of a Legend. And yeah, this is kind of like, how do you be tactful in the cafe culture? Because these are the sort of things that get people hot-headed and angry, because some people will want it to be a literally true legend. And of course, legends aren't proven history, they're legend, you know. So
yeah,
the legend of the Holy Thorn is that in the 1st century AD, Joseph of Arimathea, the uncle of Jesus Christ, came with some followers to Glastonbury, and the boat came ashore at Weary Hill, and he put his staff in the hill and said, "We are weary all," and so it became known as Weary Hill, and his staff sprouted into a thorn tree, you know. So that's the Holy Thorn of Weary Hill legend. But the history of it isn't that. You know? For instance, thorn trees only live at best 150 years, you know. So that's just it. They're not yew trees, you know. Yew trees can live for thousands of years, but thorn trees don't. And even in Glastonbury Town Hall, there's some old maps in frames on the wall in the town hall, and it shows you where the Holy Thorn was 100 years ago, and it was on a different part of Wiriel Hill to the one that got chopped down a few years ago. You know, so the holy thorn tree that was hacked down, can't remember when it was, 2010-ish, hadn't been there for centuries, you know, but the legend is old. So Adam Stout in this book goes into all of the history of the last few hundred years. You know, the bottom line is, and this is what upsets some people, is the legend only dates back to the 13th century. There was where is it? There's the very first history book of Glastonbury is this one. It's called The Antiquities of Glastonbury by William of Malmesbury. And this was written round about the 1130s, so 1130 AD, 12th century. And in this book, William of Malmesbury wrote down all of the history and legends of Glastonbury that he could find in the great library of Glastonbury Abbey. And he doesn't mention a holy thorn, you know. So, but what happened is a bit like Wikipedia, in the sense that anybody can go on Wikipedia and update it at any time. The pages are constantly updating with new information. So he wrote this around 1130 AD, and then round about 1250, an unknown person added some paragraphs. And those paragraphs that were added around 1250 are all about Joseph of Arimathea and so on and stuff. And so the Joseph of Arimathea thing is a 13th century addition to the Glastonbury mythos, if you like.
Huh.
Around 1200, the King Arthur romances have been very popular. In 1180s, the monks of the abbey claimed to find King Arthur's grave. So Glastonbury Abbey became very entrenched in the whole mystery of King Arthur. And then it's only 60 or 70 years after that that an unknown person adds the Joseph of Arimathea thing. And it gives Glastonbury Abbey a direct connection to the family of Jesus, you know, which is what they were wanting, a connection to first century Christianity. So the story then is that Jesus's uncle came to Glastonbury round about 63 AD, you know, and created a Christian community here and so on.
And was that a direct response to the monks supposedly finding the bones of King Arthur and Guinevere?
So, yeah, so there's many things going on. So there's another book. I've got all these books. This one, you can't see the title very well. Can you see it on the spine? No, it's very small print on the spine. Where is it there? This is the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Yeah, and this is 1130. And that's the very first kind of biography of King Arthur. And King Arthur is mentioned a few times briefly in earlier sources, but that is the very first story of his entire lifetime, from his childhood to the end of his life. That's the first biography of Arthur, if you like. And enigmatically, at the end of his life, Geoffrey of Monmouth says that Arthur was taken to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his mortal wound, you know. And then there's a later story by Geoffrey called The Life of Merlin, and he goes into more detail and says that the Lady Morgan Le Fay, but he just calls her the Lady Morgan, received Arthur and would heal him. But she is in some sort of otherworld realm. But just like the hollow hills of King Arthur and his knights sleeping in the hills until they're needed, that he will return when he's needed, this once and future king. So you come to the 12th century, and medieval Europe is quite fanatically Catholic. You've got the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars. You know, they were burnt and murdered and killed just for having a different version of Christianity, basically. You know, they're a different way of looking at things. But the point is, if you weren't straight down the middle Catholic, you were a heretic, and it was dangerous. You could get killed. So the Arthurian stories have lots of paranormal, esoteric things in them, but they're just stories. You know, it's just a story. After the banquet in the evening, we can hear this story from the troubadour and stuff. But inside it, there's a lot of esoteric teachings, but you're not going to get burnt at the stake because it's just a story. However, there was something niggling, and it was this, that the idea that Arthur was in Avalon, some paradise realm, and that would one day return, very, very heretical, because in the Catholic world, only one person has gone to the afterlife and will return, and that's Jesus. You know, so who is this British king in a otherworld paradise, and who is this woman, Morgan, looking after him until he returns? You know, so it's a direct challenge to the second coming of Christ, and that you can only get to paradise through Jesus and all of that. So it's in that context that Glastonbury Abbey finds King Arthur's grave. And two things are dealt with then. King Arthur isn't in a paradise to return. Here's his skeleton, you know, and also there's no Avalon paradise. That Avalon is Somerset market town. So you stop the second coming of Arthur, and also you shut the door on the Celtic otherworld. So they're the kind of Catholic motivations of the monks of Glastonbury Abbey finding King Arthur's grave. But it's even stranger than that. In this book of mine, Glastonbury and the Myths of Avalon, and this is all real history. I'll spell it all out in the book, and you can look for it yourself. There was King Richard the Lionheart, on way to the Second Crusade, stopped at the island of Sicily, and he gave to the King of Sicily a sword that he said was Excalibur. Okay. As dodgy as that is, that's true history. And in exchange for that, the King of Sicily gave Richard many ships to carry on to the Holy Land to do the crusade. So the King of Sicily believed this story about this sword being Excalibur. That was 1191, I think. I think it's 1191. That same year is when the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to find King Arthur's grave. So it kind of gives a providence for the sword that Richard gave to the King of Sicily. And the abbot of Glastonbury at the time was Richard's nephew. There's this whole family intrigue, but it gets even stranger that another arrangement with the King of Sicily is that the Princess of Sicily, the king's daughter, will marry Richard's heir. Now, Richard didn't have any children, but he agreed that she would marry his chosen heir. His chosen heir was another nephew, and this is all real history, and his nephew was Arthur of Brittany, who's a grandson of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So what was meant to have happened was, on the death of Richard the Lionheart, Arthur of Brittany would become King of England, marry the Princess of Sicily, and inherit Excalibur as his dowry, and there would have been this second coming of Arthur. And a mad idea, and that's all real history covered in my book. And there's a big mystery then, so it never came about. Richard the Lionheart died, and his brother John became King John, and nobody knows what happened to Arthur of Brittany. The suspicion is that King John had him done away with. But we don't know. But that's all real Plantagenet history, and King Arthur's grave in Glastonbury is wrapped up in that. It's mad, isn't it?
Crazy.
But financially, I don't suppose it did them any harm either, having King Arthur and Guinevere.
Yeah, so
they probably did quite well out of it.
You know, there's the famous pilgrimage to the west coast of Spain, the Camino de Compostela, Santiago thing. So Glastonbury kind of had that. It was a smaller scale thing, but there was a big pilgrimage route from Winchester to St. David's on the west coast of Wales. And so that pilgrimage to St. David's was a big thing in the early 1100s. And when this man was commissioned by the abbot to write the history of Glastonbury, the main thing he's promoting is this pilgrimage to St. David's. And apparently the abbot of Glastonbury found this ancient altar that St. David had left there. And so there was all this promotion of St. David as the founder of Glastonbury Abbey, making Glastonbury a place to visit on the big pilgrimage to St. David's. All of that fell out of favour for some reason, whether it's politics to do with England and Wales, I don't know. But the original story then was that David was the Celtic Christian founder of Glastonbury Abbey. And that Celtic Christian history all got erased after 1250, when the Joseph of Arimathea material was added to the antiquities of Glastonbury, because then there was this emphasis of Joseph creating the first church in the 1st century. So not only is it spurious and based on the King Arthur romances, it erases the actual Celtic church history of Glastonbury, which was St. David. So interesting. But the point of saying all of that was Glastonbury was involved in making money from pilgrims visiting St. David's. And then when that fell out of popularity, King Arthur's grave was a good money earner as well. Same as Vézelay in France having the bones of Mary Magdalene. You know, it's that.
Yeah.
And that's a weird thing too. I talk about that in here, this one. So this is mad. Glastonbury Abbey was the Benedictine order, and Vézelay in France is the Benedictine order. Glastonbury has the winter solstice phenomena of the sun rolling up the Tor. So it's got winter solstice law. And Vézelay in France has summer solstice law. At the summer solstice, the main aisle of the basilica is all lit up on the feast of St. John the Baptist, the summer king. So John the Baptist Day is summer solstice related. And in France, near Vézelay, that whole area is known as the Avalone.
Oh.
And it has been known as the Avalone for a long time. And most of the Arthurian romances come from that area of the Avalone. So you've actually got an Avalon in France and a summer solstice hill and a great big pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. And in England, you've got a winter solstice hill, Avalon because of King Arthur's grave, and a pilgrimage to the St. David's in the west. And they're both run by Benedictines. They're almost, the polarities, if you like, in the Benedictine church.
Gosh.
So who were the Avalonians, Yuri?
Ah, good question. Where's that book? I knew it'd come up.
You see, you've got a mountain of books behind you. Not that one, not that one.
No, I can't see it for looking, but that's crazy. When is it? Oh, there it is. The Avalonians by Patrick Benham is probably the best book you can get if you want to get your head around Glastonbury and its origins of what it becomes today. So when I talked about the late Victorian times in the age of Aquarius and Alice Buckton saying Chalice Well was the Aquarian well and things, all that comes from this book originally. Now, this is a book about what was happening in Glastonbury during the Edwardian times and the 1920s and the 1930s, and the magical occult people that were there. So you've got Alice Buckton, you've got Frederick Bligh Bond, you've got Dion Fortune, you've got Catherine Maltwood, and so on. So there's some people that think Glastonbury became hippie after the Glastonbury Festival. Well, it's not true. You know, what made Glastonbury begin was the railway, of course. You know, the railway to Weston-super-Mare from London around about 1860, and then suddenly people in London could travel to the west and they would visit Bath and Glastonbury and the grave of King Arthur and all that sort of stuff. So it's at the end of the Victorian age that all of the London mystics and occultists start drifting towards Glastonbury and the west, and they become a maverick social network focused mainly around Chalice Well. This lady, Alice Buckton, created Chalice Well as this college. When I was saying Margaret Murray gave lectures there about Egyptian origins of the Holy Grail and the Bruin witches and stuff. And then there's this book, The Rediscovery of Glastonbury, Frederick Bligh Bond, Architect of the New Age. So that New Age is deliberate. That's the age of Aquarius and all of those ideas. So this, you want to get that first. They were all given the nickname in the 1960s and 70s as the Avalonians. They were the first wave of occult tourists to Glastonbury interested in things Avalonian. So they're all affectionately called the Avalonians. So that's the first book. And then this book goes into a lot of detail about this man, Frederick Bligh Bond. And he kind of connects them all together. For instance, Frederick Bligh Bond was a friend of Dion Fortune, and he was a friend of Catherine Maltwood. And I can't prove that Dion Fortune and Catherine Maltwood knew each other, but they both knew Frederick Bligh Bond. And they're writing about similar things at the same time. For instance, both Catherine Maltwood and Dion Fortune are describing the Michael line that goes through the Tor, points to Beltane. They were writing about that in the 1930s. They're quite interesting. So then I wrote this book, Terrestrial Alignments of Catherine Maltwood and Dion Fortune, and that's all about their ideas of sacred landscape and ley lines and microlines and all the rest of it. So that's kind of my addition to the Avalonians stuff. So when you're in Glastonbury and you're talking in the cafes, a lot of the things actually only go back to the Avalonians, like the 1920s, the 1930s. And then there's going to be nerdy people like me talking about books written in the 12th century. And all of that swirls together. For instance, there was this book. It's called The High History of the Holy Grail. Is actually from 1200 AD.
Wow.
It's early 13th century book, but it wasn't translated into English because it was in Old Norman French or Old Latin. It wasn't translated into English until 1910, I think, so the end of the Edwardian times. But this was really popular with the Avalonians because it's an account of Sir Percival and the Holy Grail and all of that stuff. But right at the end, it says that the history that this story was taken from is kept at the Holy House of God, where lie King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. So that whatever we make of King Arthur's grave, it is only Glastonbury that claims to have the burial of King Arthur and Guinevere, you know? So this book from the 1200s is saying this whole Grail history comes from Glastonbury, you know? So that got the Avalonians very excited because they were thinking, all of the Grail stories, they belong to Somerset. They belong to the area of Glastonbury Abbey, and that was all based there. So Glastonbury Abbey is described as being at the head of the Moors Adventurous. In this, they call it the Moors Adventurous. That's where the Holy House of God is, where Guinevere and Arthur are buried. So Catherine Maltwood took it upon herself to, okay, Glastonbury Abbey is at the head of the Moors Adventurous. Let's backstep through the stories of the Holy Grail and see if we can figure out other locations in Somerset that relate to the Grail story. So that was her mission. And it was whilst working with this that she was reading about a massive lion in one of the adventures that one of the knights of the Round Table has to have this adventure with a big lion. And she's looking at the maps of Somerset, trying to figure out where this might have taken place. And while she's looking at the map, a lion jumps out at her from the map. And that's her eureka moment. She then carries on to look for a giant, because there's also a giant mentioned, and she finds what she believes is a representation of the giant. So she's got this lion and a giant, and she's getting quite excited. She's thinking that somehow the land is holding the story in some way. And it was a friend of hers, and we don't know who it was. She just says it wasn't until a friend suggested to her that maybe the lion and the giant are Leo the lion and something else of a big zodiac. So it was from that she then discovered what we now call the Glastonbury Zodiac, you know, but it came from this 12th century book, as bonkers as all that is, you know, and so No, I've spent years looking at the Glastonbury Zodiac and researching that, but that's all to do with the Avalonians of the 1920s and the 1930s, you know. But basically, there's a simple idea that the heavens are mirrored on the ground as a great big stargate or Temple of the Stars. Catherine called it the Temple of the Stars. It wasn't until the 1960s it was given the nickname Glastonbury Zodiac. And then there is stuff that predates her. So some people criticize her and say, oh, she invented it all. It's not true. She found a lion and then a giant. And then a friend suggested it might be a zodiac. And then she went on to find that. And in the great scheme, Glastonbury Tor is part of the Aquarian sign, the sign of Aquarius. It's not, the zodiac is huge. So Glastonbury is just Aquarius, and the Chalice Well waters are the sacred well in the Aquarian effigy. Now, Alice Buckton at Chalice Well called Chalice Well the Aquarian waters long before Catherine Maltwood said Glastonbury was Aquarius. So there's all this weird stuff that predates Catherine Maltwood's invention of the Glastonbury Zodiac. It's more like she's revealing esoteric ideas that are already present in the area. She was a sculptress, so she might have lent a hand of sculpting it, you know, but those ideas were there already, you know. All goes back to the coming of the Aquarian age and Glastonbury being a mecca for the Aquarian age, and Chalice Well being the waters of the Aquarian well and all of that stuff.
Wow, that's just really interesting. My head's just like, woof.
That's cafe culture in Glastonbury, you know. So week after week, we're talking about all of that, and we all leave the cafe feeling baffled.
You're thinking though. Your head's just, you know, you're working it through. I like it. I can't shift this feeling, and I have to ask the question because no one's going to judge me. But for some reason, I keep feeling that, and what I'm being told, were the Knights Templar around Glastonbury at all? Because I can't. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. I keep hearing it and keep feeling it while you were talking, and I thought I've got to ask.
Catherine Maltwood believed that she actually put forward the idea that the Glastonbury Zodiac was Bronze Age.
Okay.
That's really hard to prove. The landscape was different in the Bronze Age. But then she also said that she believed the Knights Templars had a hand in redefining the effigies or making it more, they enhanced it in some way. And there are landscape mysteries around the Zodiac to do with the Templars. There's a place called Temple Combe, and on the way to Bristol, there's Temple Cloud, and then the train station at Bristol is Temple Meads. These are all Knights Templar territories. And Catherine Maltwood says that in Somerset, there was something like 60 territories that belonged to the Templars. And that when they were dissolved, their territories went to the Knights of St. John, which are the Malta, the island of Malta. So I mean, it's hard to prove any of those things, but that's certainly in the medieval history. And the theory with this book of around 1200 AD that says King Arthur's grave is where this history comes from, that abbey. The abbot behind this is thought to be a chap called Henri de Blois, and he was a big financier of the Templars.
Yeah. That's why I could feel it then. I just kept hearing it in my head, and I thought I've got to ask.
Certainly, you know, in theory, the Templars are holding esoteric knowledge and that would be mystery school teachings and Star Lord teachings, which are hinted at in Glastonbury Abbey, and they're hinted at Vézelay in France. You know, that there is an undercurrent of mystery school teachings.
And that would also give you the connection with the Cathars as well, because at Mont-Saint-Gyeu, when there were reported to be quite a few Templars that were at Mont-Saint-Gyeu with the Cathars that actually came down with the Cathars and were burned. So that would give you the connection there as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
So much. There are so many books to read. I've got a list now. I've been writing them down.
Yeah. But welcome to Glastonbury cafe culture.
Yeah.
I was so lucky, so lucky, because I had it every week. Every Monday morning we would meet, my friends and I, you know, and I had that for year after year. So a lot on Facebook with the Owen Grove and other places where I talk about Star Lore, people have said, well, where'd you get this from? And what book can you recommend? And I can't, you know, it's all gone into my head from all of the cafe culture conversations that I've had with my friends. And a lot of it is just swirling around. And now and then I'll draw a diagram and explain an idea. That's all it is, you know. But these are ideas of my friends like Alan Royce and Anthony Thorley and so on, you know, Paul Weston. So there's lots of us that, because of the Stargate, because of the Glastonbury Zodiac, and as questionable as it is, it meant for year after year after year, we talked about Star Lore ideas. And Catherine Maltwood pushed all of those ideas back to the ancient mystery schools and the mystery teachings. So you're not just talking about constellations, you're talking about mysteries of Isis, mysteries of Bacchus and Dionysus, mysteries of Mithras and Perseus and stuff, you know, it just, and then trying to figure out what the Celtic people believed about the night sky, you know, so.
The rabbit hole.
The rabbit hole.
Yeah. I think I've just jumped in.
the Glastonbury rabbit hole.
Yeah. You looking forward to going back to that though and starting that up again? Yeah.
It fills my heart, definitely, you know, and chewing the cud and just wondering and sharing ideas, you know.
Yeah.
And then also it's a sacred landscape. So we would go off to places and have day trips to different locations and stuff, you know, and people do dowsing or people meditate or try and pick up on the history of a place.
Yeah. That's what,
So it's not just cafe culture, it's interacting in a kind of psychic way or a clairvoyant way or an empathic way.
Yeah, that happens down there though, doesn't it? It just, all of a sudden everything's, well, for me, it just, everything fires up and that's it. You know, you can feel so much. It's magical. Lovely.
Well, I'm really sorry, but it's 9:05 now, so I need to.
Sorry to you. Yeah, brilliant.
This is recorded and I'll put it on YouTube so you can watch back on it. And thank you very much for sitting at the cafe with me and having a chat.
Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Good luck with your move.
Yeah, good luck.